The old man sat alone beneath the dim lights of Shadow Hall, slowly eating a bowl of soup with trembling hands. No medals, no uniform, no escort. Just an 82-year-old veteran in a faded windbreaker staring at a worn photograph that looked older than most of the men inside the room. The operators barely noticed him. The young sailors assumed he was somebody's grandfather, a visitor, a retiree who had wandered into the wrong building. Rear Admiral Nathan Crowley thought the same thing. And 5 minutes later, in front of 30 elite operators, he ripped the soup bowl out of the old man's hands and ordered him to leave. The room went silent. Then a battle-hardened Master Chief dropped his fork. His face turned white. Because the old man's call sign wasn't written in any history book. It wasn't taught in any academy. It was whispered. Harbinger. The ghost who always came back. The warrior who crossed enemy lines alone. The man who never left a brother behind. And the old veteran Nathan Crowley had just humiliated was arriving that day to receive military honors so secret they had been hidden from the public for more than 50 years. Before the afternoon was over, one of the Navy's youngest admirals would learn a lesson that would change his life forever. And it would begin with a bowl of soup. The rain had started before sunrise. A cold Pacific drizzle tapped softly against the windows of Pacific Maritime Warfare Center as Elias Vance stepped through the main gate. The security guards barely looked at him. They scanned his identification, glanced at a code neither of them fully understood, and immediately waved him through. Elias thanked them with a small nod. Then he continued walking alone. His movements were slow, careful. Every step reminded him of old injuries. A shattered knee, a damaged hip, fragments of metal still buried inside his body after half a century. The doctors had offered surgeries. He had refused. Some wounds deserved to stay. They reminded him who he had survived for. Inside his jacket pocket rested a photograph. The edges were worn smooth from decades of handling. 7 young men smiled at the camera. 7 warriors. Phantom Unit 7. His family. His brothers. Only one of them was still alive. Him. Elias paused beneath a covered walkway and stared at the picture. His thumb rested on each face. Michael. Danny. Ross. Victor. Tanner. Cole. James. Gone. Every one of them gone. The last survivor besides him, James Porter, had died 3 months earlier. A heart attack in his sleep. Peaceful, people said. Elias wasn't sure there was anything peaceful about becoming the last witness to an entire generation. For the first time in 60 years, he truly felt alone. His wife had died of cancer 8 years earlier. His son had been killed during military service overseas. Most mornings he woke up in a silent house. Most evenings he sat alone. The world kept moving. The people he loved did not. That was why he had come. Not for medals, not for recognition, certainly not for applause. He had come because Shadow Hall still served the same soup Phantom Unit 7 used to eat before deployments. A small thing. A meaningless thing to most people. But memories often lived inside small things. An old song. A photograph. A bowl of soup. When he entered the dining hall, the smell hit him immediately. For a moment, he wasn't 82. For a moment, he was 24, laughing beside his team, making promises none of them could guarantee, promising they would all come home. Elias sat alone near the window. He ordered the soup, and for the first time in months, he smiled. Outside, rain slid down the glass. Inside, operators talked and laughed around him. Nobody recognized him. Nobody knew who he was, and that was exactly how he preferred it. Across the base, however, Rear Admiral Nathan Crowley was having the worst day of his career. 3 consecutive meetings. Budget disputes, personnel shortages, operational delays. Every problem seemed to land on his desk. By the time he entered Shadow Hall for a late lunch, frustration already burned inside him. Then he noticed the elderly man sitting alone in a restricted facility. Crowley stopped walking. His eyes narrowed. Something wasn't right. Without another word, he turned and began walking directly toward Elias Vance. And every step brought both men closer to a collision neither would ever forget. Rear Admiral Nathan Crowley stopped beside the table. For several seconds, he simply stood there. The old man didn't look up. Elias Vance carefully lifted a spoonful of soup to his mouth and continued eating as if nobody had approached him. Crowley found that strangely irritating. Most people recognized authority immediately, especially inside Pacific Maritime Warfare Center, especially inside Shadow Hall. Yet this elderly man seemed completely unconcerned. "Excuse me, sir." Elias slowly looked up. His pale blue eyes met Crowley's. They were calm. Too calm. Not the eyes of a confused visitor. Not the eyes of someone nervous about being caught somewhere he didn't belong. Just calm. Yes? Elias asked. Crowley folded his arms. This dining facility is restricted. Elias nodded once. So I've been told. The answer caught Crowley off guard. If you've been told, then why are you here? Elias glanced down at the bowl. I'm having lunch. A few nearby operators exchanged amused looks. Crowley wasn't amused. His patience had already been worn thin by the day. The old man's answer felt dismissive. Do you understand where you are? Yes. And you believe you're authorized to be here? I do. The response came without hesitation, without arrogance, without challenge, just certainty. Crowley's eyes narrowed. May I see your identification? Of course. Elias carefully reached into his jacket pocket. His hand trembled slightly. Age, old injuries, years of damage that time had never fully healed. He removed a worn identification card and handed it across the table. Crowley examined it. Immediately, something looked unusual. The card was authentic, no question about that. The security markings were legitimate. The photograph matched. Name, Elias Vance. Age, 82. The strange part was the authorization section. Several codes appeared where standard access classifications should have been. Most officers would have paused. Most would have asked questions. Crowley did neither. His frustration guided his judgment. He quickly concluded there had been an administrative mistake. Some old retired operator with outdated credentials. Nothing more. He handed the card back. Mr. Vance, there appears to be an error with your authorization. Elias placed the card back inside his pocket. I don't believe there is. Crowley's jaw tightened. The surrounding conversations had begun to fade. Operators were listening now. Not openly, but enough. I need you to come with me to security. Elias looked at the bowl. Steam still rose from the surface. For a moment, his expression softened, as though he were seeing something nobody else could. Then he quietly said, I haven't finished my soup. Crowley blinked. What? The soup. Elias gestured toward the bowl. I'd like to finish it. Several operators lowered their eyes. A few sensed the situation beginning to turn uncomfortable. Crowley felt his authority being tested. Not because Elias was shouting. Not because he was arguing. Because he wasn't. The old man remained completely calm. And somehow that calmness made Crowley feel even more challenged. This isn't optional. I understand. Then stand up. Elias slowly shook his head. Just give me a few minutes. The room seemed quieter now. The rain tapped softly against the windows. Forks stopped moving. Conversations died completely. Every operator could feel the tension growing. Crowley leaned closer. His voice dropped. Do you understand who you're speaking to? Elias studied him for several seconds. There was no disrespect in his gaze. Only sadness. Almost sympathy. The expression bothered Crowley more than open defiance would have. Yes. Elias said softly. I do. Then you'll stand up. The old veteran looked down at his soup again. The same soup he had once shared with 6 brothers who never returned home. The same smell, the same memory, the same promise. Just one more bowl. One final lunch with ghosts. He gently wrapped both trembling hands around the bowl. Then he looked back at Crowley. No, Admiral. The words were polite, respectful, but absolute. For the first time all afternoon, genuine anger flashed across Nathan Crowley's face, and throughout Shadow Hall, 30 elite operators realized they were about to witness something none of them would ever forget. For several seconds, nobody moved. The silence inside Shadow Hall felt heavy enough to crush steel. 30 operators watched from their tables. No one spoke. No one touched their food. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, every eye was fixed on the old man and the Admiral. Nathan Crowley's face hardened. The refusal had been polite, respectful even, but it was still a refusal, and it had happened in front of everyone. I don't think you understand the situation, Crowley said. Elias Vance remained seated. His hands rested around the bowl. The steam continued rising between them. I understand it very well. No. Crowley leaned forward. You don't. The old veteran said nothing. That silence somehow felt worse than an argument. Crowley could feel operators watching him, judging him, waiting to see how he would respond. His frustration from the entire day came boiling to the surface. Budget fights, political pressure, command responsibilities. Everything seemed to land on his shoulders. And now this elderly man was quietly refusing a direct order. Crowley's patience snapped. His palms slammed onto the table. The sound echoed through the dining hall like a gunshot. Several operators flinched. Forks froze halfway to mouths. A glass rattled. The room became completely silent. I said, "Stand up." Elias didn't move. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the bowl, toward the thin wisps of steam rising into the air. And suddenly he wasn't in Shadow Hall anymore. He was 24 years old. The memory arrived without warning. A battered wooden table. 7 men squeezed together. Young faces. Laughing faces. Phantom Unit 7. Micah was telling a terrible joke. Danny was complaining about the food. Ross was betting they'd all be home before Christmas. Nobody believed him, but they laughed anyway. Outside the old operations building, helicopters waited. Inside, they shared soup before deployment. One final meal together. One final ordinary moment. 3 days later, Michael was dead. A week later, Danny was gone. Before the year ended, half the men in the photograph would never return. The smell of the soup had brought all of them back. For one brief afternoon, Elias had been sitting with his brothers again. Then reality returned. Nathan Crowley stood over him, angry, impatient, certain. The young Admiral reached down and grabbed the bowl. Several operators immediately sat upright. A few exchanged nervous glances. The movement felt wrong, very wrong. "Admiral," one operator whispered. Too late. Crowley pulled the bowl away. Soup splashed across the table. A few drops struck the photograph lying beside Elias's hand. The bowl scraped loudly across the surface. Then Crowley set it on a nearby table. Hard. The ceramic rang sharply. The sound echoed through the room. Nobody breathed. Nobody spoke. Elias stared at the empty space in front of him. Not at Crowley. Not at the operators, not at the spilled soup, just the empty space. His expression changed, not anger, not humiliation, something far worse, loss. The look of a man who had already buried everyone he loved. The look of someone watching one final connection disappear. For the first time, several operators felt uneasy, deeply uneasy. Crowley noticed it too, but interpreted it as sympathy for a confused old man. "You've had enough opportunities," he said firmly. "Now stand up, slowly. Painfully." Elias pushed himself to his feet. The movement looked difficult. One hand gripped the table, the other pressed against his hip. Old injuries protested immediately. His damaged knee trembled. His back stiffened. For a moment it looked as though he might collapse. Yet somehow he remained standing. At 5 feet 9 inches, slightly stooped with age, he appeared completely harmless. Just an elderly man. Thin, fragile, alone. But when he finally raised his head, something changed. Those pale blue eyes no longer looked tired. They no longer looked old. For one brief moment, they looked dangerous. The room felt colder. Crowley noticed it. So did every operator present. And for reasons none of them could explain, a quiet sense of dread began spreading through Shadow Hall. Then Crowley asked the question that would change everything. "Who exactly do you think you are?" The old veteran looked directly into his eyes, and for several long seconds he said nothing. The silence stretched. No one moved. No one dared. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows of Shadow Hall while 30 operators sat frozen around the room. Rear Admiral Nathan Crowley stood face to face with the old veteran. "Who exactly do you think you are?" he repeated. The question hung in the air. Elias Vance studied him, not with anger, not with fear. Not even with resentment. He looked at Crowley the way an old teacher might look at a student who had not yet learned an important lesson. Then his gaze drifted around the room, across the operators, across the walls covered with photographs, across the memorial plaques honoring the fallen. For a brief moment, he seemed far away, lost in another time, another war, another life. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Yet somehow, every person in the dining hall heard it. "They used to call me," he paused. The words felt heavy, as though they carried decades with them. Harbinger. The reaction was immediate. A fork crashed onto a plate. Metal struck ceramic with a sharp crack. Several operators jumped. One chair scraped violently against the floor. At a nearby table, Master Chief Owen Rourke had gone completely pale. His eyes widened. For a moment he simply stared, as if he had seen a ghost rise from the dead. Crowley frowned. The name meant nothing to him. Absolutely nothing. Harbinger? He repeated. The title sounded ridiculous, almost theatrical. He looked around the room. Confusion quickly became irritation. Is this some kind of joke? Nobody laughed. Nobody smiled. Owen Rourke suddenly stood so fast his chair toppled backward. The crash echoed through the hall. Every head turned. The Master Chief's breathing had quickened. His hands trembled. Not from fear, from disbelief. Oh my God. The words escaped before he could stop them. Crowley stared. Master Chief? Rourke barely heard him. His eyes remained locked on Elias, on the old man standing quietly beside the table. The old man everyone had ignored. The old man whose soup had just been taken away. The old man who looked more like a retired school teacher than a warrior. And yet Owen Rourke knew. Every operator with enough years in the community knew the stories had survived. The legends had survived, even if the official records had not. Rourke stepped forward slowly, carefully, like a man approaching something sacred. Sir, his voice cracked. Elias gave a small nod. Recognition passed between them. Nothing dramatic, nothing spoken, yet everyone in the room could feel it. Crowley's confusion deepened. What is going on? Rourke turned toward him. The expression on the Master Chief's face made Crowley's stomach tighten. It wasn't anger. It wasn't panic. It was something worse. Absolute certainty. Sir. Rourke swallowed hard. You need to stop. Crowley's jaw tightened. Excuse me? You need to stop right now. The room seemed to shrink. Every operator was watching. Every operator was listening. Crowley felt his authority being challenged yet again. Master Chief, explain yourself. Rourke took a slow breath. Then he spoke words that changed the atmosphere instantly. Harbinger isn't a nickname. His eyes moved back toward Elias. It's a legend. No one spoke. Rourke continued. My grandfather served in Ghost Operations Command. Several older operators immediately sat straighter. They recognized the name. Most younger ones did not. He told stories nobody believed. Rourke's voice shook slightly. Stories about a man who crossed enemy lines alone. A few operators exchanged glances. The man who always came back. Silence. The man commanders called when recovery missions were impossible. Silence. The man who brought the dead home. Several faces began changing. Recognition, shock, disbelief. Crowley looked at Elias again. Still nothing made sense. This frail old man, impossible. Absolutely impossible. Rourke took another step forward, then another. Finally, he stopped directly in front of Elias. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. Sir, he swallowed. Please tell me you're not the Harbinger. Elias remained silent for several seconds. Then he gave the smallest nod. The room froze, and for the first time since entering Shadow Hall, genuine uncertainty appeared in Nathan Crowley's eyes. Because suddenly, it felt as though every person in the building knew something he didn't, and the realization terrified him. Then the main doors of Shadow Hall opened, and everything became much worse. The doors of Shadow Hall swung open with a force that immediately drew every eye in the room. The silence that had settled over the dining hall deepened. Even the rain outside seemed to fade. Two uniformed commanders entered first. Commander Blake Sutton. Commander Eric Holloway. Both were senior officers with records that commanded respect throughout the fleet. Yet neither of them was the reason the room suddenly stood at attention. The man walking behind them was Fleet Admiral Jonathan Mercer. 4 stars gleamed on his shoulders. The highest-ranking officer in the operational Navy. A man who commanded thousands. A man whose schedule was measured in minutes and whose decisions affected nations. The moment operators recognized him, chairs scraped backward. Every sailor in the room stood. Every sailor except one, Elias Vance. The old veteran remained beside his table, calm, unmoved, as though the arrival of one of the most powerful military leaders in the country meant absolutely nothing. Nathan Crowley's stomach tightened. Mercer wasn't supposed to be here. Not today. Not in Shadow Hall, and certainly not during this disaster. The Admiral walked directly into the room, past the operators, past the officers, past Crowley, without acknowledging any of them. His focus never left Elias. The entire hall watched in silence. Mercer stopped in front of the old veteran. Then something happened that nobody expected. The Fleet Admiral smiled. Not a formal smile, not a political smile, a genuine one, the kind reserved for old friends. You're early. Elias shrugged slightly. Traffic was light. A few operators blinked. Was the Fleet Admiral joking? Mercer actually laughed, a quiet laugh. One filled with relief. I should have known. Elias nodded. You usually do. The exchange felt surreal. Nathan Crowley could hardly process what he was seeing. The most powerful officer in the Navy was speaking to this elderly man as an equal, not as a retiree, not as a civilian, an equal. Then Mercer noticed the spilled soup on the table. His eyes moved slowly across the scene. The photograph, the empty chair, the operators. Finally, they settled on Crowley. For the first time since entering the room, the Fleet Admiral's expression changed. The warmth disappeared. What happened here? Nobody answered. Nobody wanted to. Crowley's mouth suddenly felt dry. Before he could speak, Mercer's gaze shifted. The Fleet Admiral noticed the bowl sitting on a separate table several feet away. The bowl Crowley had taken. The bowl that had belonged in front of Elias. Mercer's eyes narrowed. When he spoke again, his voice was calm. Too calm, Admiral Crowley. Sir. Why are you holding Mr. Vance's lunch hostage? The room froze. A few operators lowered their eyes. Others stared directly at Crowley. The question landed harder than any shouted accusation. Crowley opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. Sir, there appears to have been a misunderstanding. Mercer stared at him. A misunderstanding? Yes, sir. Crowley forced himself to continue. I believed Mr. Vance was unauthorized to be here. Mercer's expression remained unreadable. And what led you to that conclusion? The identification codes didn't match standard access classifications. Mercer's eyes sharpened instantly. What codes? Crowley repeated the authorization markings. The reaction was immediate. Commander Sutton looked away. Commander Holloway exhaled slowly. Even Dr. Samuel Whitaker, the Pentagon security specialist, standing near the entrance, closed his eyes briefly, as if hearing something painful. Mercer simply stared. The silence became unbearable. Finally, he spoke. You saw those authorization codes? Yes, sir. And you assumed he didn't belong here? Crowley hesitated. The answer suddenly sounded foolish even to him. Yes, sir. Mercer looked toward Elias, then back at Crowley. When he spoke next, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Those codes grant access beyond yours. The room went completely still. Crowley's pulse spiked. Mercer took one step closer, beyond mine. Another step, beyond everyone currently standing in this building. Shock spread across the room. Several operators exchanged stunned looks. Crowley felt the floor shift beneath him, because for the first time, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an administrative error. And this wasn't an old man who had wandered into the wrong place. He had just taken a bowl of soup away from someone far more important than he could possibly imagine. Then Dr. Whitaker stepped forward carrying a thick black folder stamped with classification markings. And everyone in Shadow Hall understood that the truth was finally about to be revealed. Nobody sat down. Nobody spoke. The entire dining hall remained frozen as Dr. Samuel Whitaker carried the black folder toward Fleet Admiral Jonathan Mercer. The folder itself looked ordinary, but every person in the room recognized the markings. Top-level classification, restricted access, the kind of documents most military careers never came close to seeing. Whitaker handed the folder to Mercer. The Fleet Admiral accepted it carefully. For the first time, Nathan Crowley noticed something unusual. Mercer's hands were steady, but his eyes weren't. There was emotion there, respect, admiration, something deeper. The kind of expression usually reserved for heroes. Crowley's stomach sank. Mercer opened the folder. The first pages were covered in black redactions. Entire paragraphs disappeared beneath thick lines. Dates, names, operations, locations. Most of it remained hidden. Yet even what remained visible was enough to leave the room speechless. Mercer looked around the hall, then began reading. Elias Vance. The room grew silent. Call sign, Harbinger. Mercer's voice echoed through Shadow Hall. Former operative, Phantom Unit 7. Several older operators exchanged glances. Even among elite military circles, that name carried weight. Mercer continued. Deep Recon Group Alpha. Another pause. Ghost Operations Command. The silence deepened. Crowley had heard rumors of Ghost Operations Command. Most officers had. Nobody knew much about it. Officially, many of its missions never existed. Unofficially, entire wars had been influenced by men from those units. Mercer turned another page. His expression hardened. Confirmed combat deployments? 38. A few operators shifted uneasily. 38 deployments alone would define most military careers. Mercer wasn't finished. Confirmed deep penetration rescue missions? 27. The room remained silent. Successful extractions from enemy-controlled territory? 16. A few operators glanced toward Elias. The old veteran stood quietly beside the table. His expression never changed, as though they were discussing someone else. Mercer continued. Confirmed recovery operations involving missing personnel declared unrecoverable by command. He paused, then looked directly at Crowley. 14. The significance hit immediately. Operators understood exactly what that meant. These weren't rescue missions. These were impossible missions. The kind commanders usually refused. The kind people died attempting. Yet somehow Elias had completed 14 of them. Mercer turned another page. The room seemed to shrink. Decorations. Nobody breathed. Silver Star. Pause. Silver Star. Ford. Pause. Silver Star. Several heads turned. 3 silver stars. Already extraordinary. Mercer continued. Distinguished Service Cross. Another pause. Distinguished Service Cross. Then another. A third. Shock spread visibly through the room. 3 Distinguished Service Crosses. Many legendary operators never received one. Elias had earned 3. Mercer's voice softened. 7 Purple Hearts. Even Crowley looked stunned. 7 separate combat wounds, severe enough to merit recognition. 7 times he had bled for missions most people would never know existed. Mercer slowly closed the page, then looked toward Elias. For several moments, neither man spoke. It felt like a conversation taking place without words. Finally, Mercer continued. The enemy gave him the name Harbinger. The room listened. They believed wherever he appeared, something terrible followed. A memory flashed behind Elias's eyes. Night. Rain. Gunfire. A burning helicopter. Men screaming through radio static. Mercer's voice continued. Enemy commanders altered operations after learning he was nearby. Another page turned. They redirected battalions. Another pause. They abandoned positions. Another. They evacuated compounds. Shock spread through the operators. Crowley stared. None of it felt real. How could this quiet old man be the same figure described in the reports? Mercer answered without knowing the question. He wasn't feared because of what he destroyed. The fleet admiral looked directly at Elias. He was feared because he always came back. The words settled heavily across the room. Not because they sounded impressive, because everyone believed them. Every person present suddenly understood something. Harbinger wasn't a warrior who chased glory. He wasn't a hunter. He wasn't a killer. He was a man who refused to abandon his people, no matter the cost, no matter the danger, no matter the odds. Mercer slowly opened the final section of the file. Then his expression changed. Even after everything already revealed, this page was different. The room noticed immediately. Crowley noticed too. What is it? He asked quietly. Mercer looked up. For several long seconds he said nothing. Then he spoke words that sent a chill through every person in Shadow Hall. Everything I've read so far, he closed the folder halfway, is only the public portion. The room froze. Mercer's eyes moved toward Elias, then back to the operators. The truly classified record begins on the next page, and suddenly everyone understood. The legend of Harbinger was far bigger than they had imagined. Nobody in Shadow Hall moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Fleet Admiral Jonathan Mercer slowly closed the folder and looked toward Elias Vance. The old veteran remained standing beside the table. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Steam still drifted from the abandoned bowl of soup. For a moment, Mercer appeared lost in thought. Then he spoke. There is one mission. His voice carried through the room. One mission that explains everything. Every operator listened, even Nathan Crowley, especially Nathan Crowley. Mercer continued. 49 years ago, Phantom Unit 7 entered Black Ridge Province. The name meant little to the younger operators. To the older veterans, it meant danger, a place few men entered willingly, a place many never left. It was supposed to be a reconnaissance operation. Mercer looked down at the file. It became a disaster. The room fell silent, and for the first time that day, Elias closed his eyes. The memories came immediately. The jungle, the rain, the smell of mud and gunpowder, the sound of rotor blades overhead. He was young again, strong, fast, certain. Phantom Unit 7 moved through dense terrain beneath a moonless sky. 7 men, 7 brothers. They had trained together, fought together, bled together. The mission seemed simple. Gather intelligence, confirm enemy movements, extract before dawn. Instead, they walked into an ambush. Mercer's voice continued. Enemy forces outnumbered them nearly 20 to 1. A few operators exchanged stunned looks. 20 to 1. The odds sounded impossible. They were surrounded within minutes. The flashback grew stronger. Gunfire erupted from every direction. Trees exploded around them. Radio operators were hit first, then Michael, then Ross, The night became chaos. Elias remembered shouting commands, remembered dragging wounded men into cover, remembered watching tracers cut through darkness. The jungle itself seemed alive with enemy fire. Mercer turned another page. Command ordered immediate withdrawal. A pause. Only 3 members of Phantom Unit 7 reached the extraction point. The room listened carefully. 4 men remained behind. Several operators lowered their eyes. They already knew what that usually meant. Missing in action. Presumed dead. Mission over. Move on. Mercer's voice hardened. Command declared recovery impossible. The room remained silent. Then he added, Elias Vance disagreed. A faint smile touched the corner of Owen Rourke's mouth. He already knew where the story was going. Mercer continued. Against orders, he went back. The room froze. Crowley stared. He went back alone. Another silence. Into enemy territory. Another. Without support. Another. Without permission. The operators exchanged glances. Every one of them understood exactly how insane that decision was. Mercer's voice lowered. For 3 days, he moved through hostile territory. The flashback sharpened. Rain soaked everything. Blood mixed with mud. Elias crawled through darkness, avoided patrols, moved at night, slept in minutes, never hours, searching, always searching. Michael was dead. Ross was dead. He found them first. He carried their identification tags, their letters, their personal effects, anything their families deserved to receive, anything that proved they had mattered. But 2 men remained alive, barely. Mercer continued. He located the survivors 30 miles behind enemy lines. Shock spread through the room. 30 miles. 1 man. 3 days. Impossible. Yet Elias had done it. One operator whispered quietly, "My God." Mercer nodded. One had a shattered leg. Another page turned. The other had lost significant blood and could no longer walk. Silence. The odds somehow became worse. Elias remembered lifting 1 man onto his shoulders, remembered carrying another beside him, remembered moving through darkness while enemy patrols searched nearby. Every step hurt. Every step risked death. But he kept moving, because leaving them behind was never an option. Never. Mercer closed the folder, then looked directly at Nathan Crowley. The enemy intercepted radio traffic during that operation. The room listened. They believed Harbinger had escaped. A pause. They were wrong. Another pause. When they realized he had returned for his men, they began using a new warning. Mercer looked toward Elias. A faint sadness crossed the old veteran's face. They told each other. The room grew completely silent. Harbinger is coming. Nobody spoke. Nobody could. Because suddenly everyone understood. The name wasn't earned through victories. It wasn't earned through medals. It wasn't earned through fear. Harbinger became a legend because he refused to abandon his brothers, no matter the cost, no matter the danger, no matter the orders. And for the first time all afternoon, Nathan Crowley felt truly ashamed. Because he had taken a bowl of soup away from a man who had spent his entire life bringing people home. The silence inside Shadow Hall felt different now. Before, it had been tension. Now it was judgment. 30 operators stood around the room, and not one of them was looking at Elias Vance anymore. They were looking at Nathan Crowley. The young Admiral felt every gaze, every second, every heartbeat. For the first time in years, he wished he could disappear. Fleet Admiral Jonathan Mercer slowly placed the classified folder on the table. No one spoke. No one needed to. The facts were already devastating. The old man Crowley had treated like an unwanted visitor was one of the most respected warriors in military history. A man whose actions had saved countless lives. A man whose classified record outweighed the accomplishments of entire careers. And Crowley had taken away his lunch. The absurdity of it struck him like a physical blow. Mercer looked directly at him. The disappointment in the Fleet Admiral's eyes felt worse than anger. Much worse. Nathan. The use of his first name immediately made Crowley's stomach tighten. Mercer only did that when something was serious. Very serious. Yes, sir. Do you know what your mistake was? Crowley swallowed. Misidentifying Mr. Vance, sir. No. The answer came instantly. Crowley blinked. Mercer continued. Your mistake happened long before you saw his identification. The room listened. Mercer took a step closer. You judged him before you spoke to him. Crowley lowered his eyes. The words hit harder than he expected. You saw an elderly man. Another step. You saw worn clothing. Another. You saw shaking hands. Mercer's voice remained calm, controlled. But every word landed like a hammer. And you decided you already knew his value. The room remained silent. Crowley felt heat rise into his face because the Fleet Admiral was right, painfully right. He had made assumptions, dozens of them, without evidence, without investigation, without curiosity. The very behaviors he spent years teaching younger officers to avoid. Mercer folded his arms. Tell me something, Admiral. Sir, if Mr. Vance had walked in wearing medals, would you have treated him differently? The question struck with brutal force. Crowley didn't answer because he knew the truth. Everyone knew. Mercer nodded slowly. Exactly. The silence grew heavier. Across the room, Elias remained quiet. He neither defended Crowley nor attacked him. He simply listened. Mercer turned toward the operators. Leadership is dangerous. Every person paid attention. It becomes even more dangerous when authority convinces you that your first impression is always correct. Several operators nodded. Crowley stared at the floor. Every word felt directed straight at him, because it was. Mercer looked back toward him. In combat, assumptions get people killed. The room froze. The sentence landed harder than anything before it. Crowley remembered teaching those exact words to younger officers. Now they were being thrown back at him, and he deserved it. Mercer exhaled slowly. Then came the sentence Crowley had been dreading. Under normal circumstances, the Fleet Admiral paused. I would remove you from command today. The words hit like a gunshot. Several operators visibly stiffened. Crowley's chest tightened. For a brief moment, he couldn't breathe. Everything he had worked for flashed through his mind. Years of service, deployments, sacrifices, promotions, his command, his future. All of it suddenly felt fragile. One decision. One moment of arrogance, one terrible assumption, and everything could disappear. The room remained silent. Nobody looked away. Mercer wasn't finished. What happened here was not a procedural failure. His gaze sharpened. It was a character failure. Crowley felt the words cut deep because they were true, much deeper than any administrative mistake, much deeper than a security error. This was about humility, respect, humanity. Things every leader was supposed to possess. Mercer looked toward Elias, then back at Crowley. And yet, the single word stopped the room. Crowley slowly raised his head. A flicker of hope appeared. Mercer noticed. So don't thank me. The Fleet Admiral's voice softened slightly. Because this next part isn't my decision. Crowley's confusion returned. Mercer stepped aside. Every eye in Shadow Hall turned toward Elias Vance. The old veteran stood quietly beside the table. His weathered hands rested against the chair. His expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. Mercer nodded respectfully toward him, then spoke words nobody expected. Mr. Vance has requested that no disciplinary action be taken. Shock swept through the room. Crowley's eyes widened. Several operators exchanged stunned looks. Even Owen Rourke appeared surprised. Mercer continued. He believes punishment is not what you need. Crowley stared at Elias, unable to understand. After everything that had happened, why? Why show mercy? Elias finally looked up. His pale blue eyes met Crowley's. There was no anger in them, no bitterness. Only something far more powerful, wisdom. Then the old veteran took a slow step forward and prepared to teach the lesson that had taken him an entire lifetime to learn. Nobody in Shadow Hall expected Elias Vance to speak. Not after everything that had happened. Not after being humiliated. Not after having his lunch taken away. Not after standing quietly while his life sacrifices were revealed to an entire room. Yet there he stood, calm, patient, almost gentle. The same man who had crossed enemy territory alone. The same man who had carried wounded brothers through impossible odds. The same man enemy commanders had feared for decades. And now every eye in the room was fixed on him, especially Nathan Crowley's. The young admiral stood rigidly at attention, not because regulations demanded it, because shame did. Elias looked at him for several moments, then spoke. Relax, Admiral. Crowley blinked. Sir? You're standing like you're waiting for a firing squad. The few operators allowed themselves the faintest smile. The tension eased slightly, only slightly. Crowley swallowed. I'm sorry, sir. Elias nodded. I know. The answer surprised him. No anger, no accusation, just certainty. Elias slowly lowered himself into the chair. The movement looked painful. Years of injuries made even simple motions difficult. When he settled down, He glanced toward the photograph still resting on the table. His fingertips touched the worn edge. For a moment, his expression softened. Then he looked back at Crowley. "You know what the strange thing is?" Crowley remained silent. "I understand exactly why you did what you did." The room listened carefully. Elias continued. "When I was your age, I thought I knew everything too." Several operators exchanged glances. Even Mercer smiled faintly. The old veteran's eyes drifted toward the window. Rain continued falling outside. "I thought experience belonged to the strongest people." A pause. "I thought authority meant wisdom." Another. "I thought age was something that happened to other men." The room remained silent. Then Elias looked down at his trembling hands. Eventually, life corrects those assumptions. Crowley felt something shift inside him. Because these weren't the words of a hero giving a speech. They were the words of a man speaking honestly. A man speaking from pain. Elias continued quietly. "When you saw me today." He lifted one trembling hand. "What did you see?" Crowley hesitated, then answered truthfully. "An old man." Elias nodded. "Exactly." The answer carried no bitterness, only understanding. "You saw age." He pointed toward his worn jacket. "You saw old clothes." Toward his shaking hand. "You saw weakness." The room remained silent. Then Elias leaned slightly forward. "What you didn't see were the funerals." Crowley's chest tightened. Elias continued. "You didn't see me bury my wife." Silence. "You didn't see me bury my son." More silence. "You didn't see me stand beside 6 graves belonging to men I loved more than brothers." The room grew still. Several operators lowered their eyes. Elias smiled sadly. "Most people don't." His gaze moved across the room. "That's the point." Nobody spoke. Elias continued. "Every person you meet is carrying something." A pause. Loss. Another. Fear. Another. Pain. His voice softened. History. The room listened, because every word felt true. Some people carry burdens you can see. Elias looked at his damaged hands. Others carry burdens nobody notices. Another pause. Either way, they deserve respect. Crowley felt his throat tighten. The lesson hit harder than any reprimand Mercer could have delivered, because it wasn't about rank. It wasn't about military mistakes. It was about humanity. Elias studied him, then asked quietly, "Do you know why the enemy called me Harbinger?" Crowley shook his head. The old veteran smiled faintly. Not proudly, not boastfully, just sadly. "Most people think it's because I was dangerous." Silence. "They're wrong." His fingers rested on the photograph. "They called me Harbinger because every time my brothers disappeared." His voice grew distant. "I came back for them." The room froze. Elias stared at the photograph, at the faces of men gone for decades. Dead. A pause. Wounded. Another. Missing. His eyes glistened slightly. "I didn't leave them." Nobody moved. Nobody dared. Then Elias looked directly at Crowley. "And leadership is the same thing." The young Admiral listened carefully. "You don't abandon your people." Another pause. "You don't dismiss them." Another. "You don't decide their worth based on what you see." The room remained silent. Elias smiled gently. "You learn who they are." Crowley felt his eyes burn. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about command or promotions or reputation. He was simply listening, learning, growing. And for the first time that afternoon, Elias Vance believed the lesson had finally reached him. Then Fleet Admiral Mercer checked his watch. The ceremony would begin in less than 20 minutes. And what happened next would ensure nobody in that auditorium ever forgot the name Harbinger. 20 minutes later, the doors of Valor Auditorium opened. More than 300 personnel filled the room. Operators, commanders, veterans, government officials, families. Many had no idea why they had been called there. Others knew only fragments. A handful understood the truth. At the center of the stage stood a single chair, simple, unremarkable, reserved for a man who had spent most of his life avoiding attention. Elias Vance, Harbinger. As he entered the auditorium, something extraordinary happened. The entire room stood, not because protocol demanded it, because respect did. A wave of applause rolled across the hall. It grew louder, stronger, longer. Yet Elias seemed uncomfortable with every second of it. He nodded politely. Nothing more. Fleet Admiral Jonathan Mercer escorted him to the front row. For several moments, the applause continued. Finally, it faded. The ceremony began. A large screen illuminated behind the stage. Photographs appeared, black and white images. Young operators smiling beside helicopters. Mission briefings. Training exercises. Faces frozen in time. Then came the image Elias knew best. Phantom Unit 7. The photograph from his pocket. 7 young men standing shoulder to shoulder. 6 of them never made it home. The auditorium fell silent. Mercer stepped to the podium. His voice carried throughout the hall. For decades, portions of Elias Vance's service remained classified. The screen changed. Mission summaries appeared. Rescue operations. Recovered personnel. Lives saved. Impossible missions completed. Gasps spread through the audience. Even seasoned operators looked stunned. Many had never heard these stories. Some could hardly believe them. Then Mercer revealed the final declassified citations. 3 distinguished service crosses. 3 silver stars. 7 purple hearts. Countless classified commendations. Yet the audience remained most moved by something else. The number of personnel brought home. The number of names that would not have returned without him. Families who received answers. Families who received closure. Families who received loved ones. Mercer looked toward Elias, then spoke the words everyone would remember. History often celebrates victories. A pause. Harbinger taught us to celebrate loyalty. The room erupted into applause. Many operators stood again. Some veterans openly wiped away tears. Nathan Crowley sat silently among them. His eyes never left the stage. He had entered Shadow Hall believing leadership was authority. He now understood leadership was responsibility. When the applause finally settled, Mercer invited Elias to speak. The old veteran approached the podium slowly. His movements remained stiff, painful. Age had taken much from him, but not his presence. The room immediately fell silent. Elias looked across the audience. Hundreds of faces stared back. Young operators, future leaders, the next generation. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he smiled, a small, tired smile. I think they've already said enough nice things about me. Laughter spread gently through the room. The tension eased. Elias continued. Most of the men in those stories aren't here. His voice softened. They're the reason any of this matters. The auditorium became silent again. He glanced toward the photograph displayed behind him. His brothers, his family, his ghosts. Then he spoke the final lesson. If you remember anything from today, a pause. Bring your people home. Another. Listen before you judge. Another. Lead with humility. The room listened carefully. And never decide someone's value based on what you see. Silence. Complete silence. Then Elias smiled one last time, because the strongest person in the room might look like the weakest. The audience rose together, a standing ovation. 300 people, not for a warrior, not for a legend, but for a man who had spent his life refusing to leave others behind. After the ceremony ended, people gathered around him. Operators asked questions. Veterans shook his hand. Families thanked him. Yet eventually the crowd moved on. The auditorium emptied, the lights dim, and Elias found himself alone. Just for a moment. He reached into his jacket, removed the old photograph, the same worn picture he had carried all day. The faces smiled back at him, young forever, untouched by time, untouched by age, untouched by loss. For a long moment he stared at them, then he smiled. A genuine smile, the kind nobody else had seen. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight finally broke through the clouds. Warm light spilled across the photograph, across the faces of 7 young men, across the hands of the last survivor. Elias carefully touched each face, one by one, then whispered the words he had waited decades to say. We made it, boys. His voice trembled, not from age, from love. We're all home now, and for the first time in many years, the ghost called Harbinger felt at peace.